I'm Ted Cruz, and I approve this message.
We're seeing Silicon Valley billionaires drunk with power. We've seen big tech, Twitter and Facebook, actively interfering in this election in a way that has no precedent in the history of our country. The Senate Judiciary Committee wants to know what the hell is going on. Judiciary Committee, issue a subpoena to Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, to come before this committee and the American people and explain why Twitter is abusing their corporate power to silence the press and to cover up allegations of corruption. Big tech billionaires don't get to censor political speech and actively interfere in the election. It has no precedent in the history of democracy.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
Was blind, but now I see.
Coward! Me coward! Me coward! Me coward! Coward! Me coward!
Welcome to Debate Me, Coward. Now, joining us today is Rob Larson. Now, Rob is a professor of economics at Tacoma Community College and author of the book Tyrants, The Political Economy of Silicon Valley, out now from Haymarket Books. Now, I want to take issue with something you did right off the bat, Rob, and that is, first off, like a lot of other ironic leftist professors, you have a Twitter account. That's at Ironic Professor. You are the Ironic Professor. I'm not sure why you don't have a Gab account if you hate, big tech companies so much. But
that's right. Yeah, I'm reluctant to use platforms that have no human users, so that's a downside.
Wow. Okay. All right. Hold on there. All right. Now, I'm on Gab, so I'm a human user, and I may be talking to a bunch of bots, but that's my own business. Now, your bio says you steal from the rich and drink to the poor. Now, I want to start things off by letting you know this is a Law and Order podcast, so we don't take too kindly to thieves or promoting crimes. So I want to give you an opportunity to apologize to the rich and also explain to our listeners that you don't advocate stealing.
Yes, well, of course, I apologize to any insanely wealthy people who live their lives in the stratospheric global jet traveling world of the planetary ruling class. I deeply apologize if my playful jokes and spoofs have in any way discomfited them or forced their cringing lackeys to refer to any criticism that they've experienced. I deeply regret that, and I'll drink to that instead.
Well, thank you, Rob. Now, I'm not rich myself, but I feel for them. And so on behalf of the rich, I want to say thank you. And also I want you to know that you were previously a guest on this show, and a few things have changed since then. And one is we no longer use hateful language. So the word billionaires will not be used. Instead, I'd like you in this interview to use the phrase people of wealth.
Yes, the billionaire, that's, I understand that is now called the B slur. Billionaire. So I will also apologize for using that term hurtfully.
Yeah.
Okay.
Howard Schultz, CEO of Starbucks, former CEO, he's the one who really introduced that into the lexicon. But you are here to tell us about your new book, Tyrants. So what is that all about, Rob?
Yeah, well, Tyrants is just a book about the big tech industry and why the 5 biggest companies in America are all these tech platforms that provide an online service that bring together different types of users or creators of different types of online services or content, and just looks at why those companies tend to be utterly dominant in the markets in which they operate and why they end up monopolizing or maybe having 2 gigantic firms that run all of these industries, which are only a few years old after all. So there's something to explain there, the economics of why these industries are out of the box monopolies, as the Economist magazine put it.
Wait, but these aren't monopolies, right? Because you have like Microsoft and Apple, or like with the phones, Apple and Samsung. Right, we have choice. You could use Facebook. You could use Twitter.
Yes, you have a rich diversity of 2 options. which is almost too many, I think, for many consumers. It's like 2 options. How am I going to choose? I wish there were fewer.
It can be confusing. The ketchup catsup debate.
Let's not reopen that painful debate. That's almost a new civil war right there, that one. So we'll try to avoid that.
So yeah, we do want to try to avoid having a civil war. And I will say, your book is really well written, and it gives a good history of the top 5 big tech companies and, how they have grown so large, and also a good look at their histories and how it might not exactly line up with some of our more, the mainstream ideas of where they came from, i.e. garages.
Yeah, I always love it when the press is covering these gigantic companies, which are now, like, Google is worth over $1 trillion in its market capitalization.
Just incredible, just amazing.
Yeah, Apple's worth more than $2 trillion, like insanely towering empires of wealth these companies are. And the first thing that every journalist has to do is to say, and it's extra amazing because they were founded in a garage. Can you imagine?
I can imagine, Rob. I'm so glad my dad bought me stock in Apple and Google and all that in the 90s. Man, I couldn't do this podcast without those dividends.
Yeah, that's lucky. That's how we get to be big time, broadcasters, is with that huge amount of money. But what's annoying about it, of course, is broadly these companies weren't founded in garages. I mean, some of the companies are, but the technology itself is usually developed by the public sector, or like Google, it was developed at Stanford with National Science Foundation money, and of course, lots of tax funding there. Apple's mobile technology was developed by a couple of small firms, and all the smartphones use a ton of military and other publicly developed technology. You might charter your corporation in a garage, but to say these companies, like, the technology was invented in a garage, it's just a fatuous saw that lazy reporters repeat.
Yeah, that's the thing I want to ask you about. In your book, you had a line that says, nearly all scientific and engineering research that went into today's fancy high-tech products and services came from the public sector. Now, is that a misprint? I believe it should be private sector, because these are all privately owned companies now, right?
Yes, I'm afraid that chapter has 6,000 typos in it, and everywhere I meant to say private, I wrote public. What a goof up that was.
Find and replace, I think, could help you.
Yeah, I know. I should have thought of that. Oh, but it's terrible. Yeah, so as misprinted, you can review how surprisingly almost all the hard technology in your Android or iPhone smartphones today, and a large amount of the actual platform's technologies too, like Google search software, or indeed the internet itself, which is required for all these companies to be able to run their trillion-dollar platforms. It mostly comes out of public sector research and development. And again, that's a misprint. I, of course, meant to say private funding, for example, from big private institutions like the Pentagon or the MIT company. Those are private companies that someone owns, I'm sure. I should think.
Well, either way, Rob, we are at least now lucky that they have become private, because at the time, the internet, they didn't see much value, right? Modern internet was actually turned down by AT&T and IBM for not being seen as profitable. So luckily, we live in a world now where they did see it as profitable, so now we have fancy smartphones and everything.
It's true. IBM and AT&T turned down offers from the Pentagon and the National Science Establishment to run, to take over the internet and run it, which is kind of a funny thing for them to end up rejecting because, they were afraid it was going to jeopardize their existing dynamic business lines in, giant mainframe computers or voice telephone service. So, maybe not the best choice on their parts. But it's not just those guys, too. Like Bill Gates in the early 90s was declining to attend conferences about the early internet and the very early World Wide Web at that time, and was patronizing to his colleagues about the idea of it, primarily based on the fact that the services are often free online. And he said, how do you make money from that? What are you, a communist? And he actually made those references. So obviously his fortune was able to recover from that mistake, though. Thank goodness.
Well, yeah, that is true. Thank goodness. And it's recovered very successfully. He's grown very, very large. I won't get his vaccine, but, so much so that your book now, you're calling him right on the cover, Bit Tyrants. you're calling a tyrant. And so I'm an American. I don't know about you, but when I hear the word tyrant, I'm reminded of like Sic Semper Tyrannis, the blood of the tyrants. These are things that pop up into my head. And I want to make sure that you're not advocating. I understand, we may not see eye to eye, because you're a liberal economist. Would you say that? Or would you go further?
I would go further. Well, I mean, I think that sounds, liberal sounds like a nice, safe choice. But I'm looking at my CV here, and unfortunately, it looks like someone's written socialist economist on it. So,
oh man,
it's in print, so I assume it's true.
Those Russian trolls will say anything. But is there anything leftier than Keynes? I mean, really?
Those trolls are always getting on my CV. I wish they'd stop that. Yes, it must be an error because yes, Keynes and big liberals of today. Your big liberals like your Joe Biden, your Pete Buttigieg. Like surely that's the leftmost boundary of modern debate. I'm sure.
Well, I hope so.
Well, I just want to make sure that even as a socialist, you're not advocating for like launching, the bald wonder himself, that beautiful bald man, Jeff Bezos, into the sun and costing us, the sort of regulation that would cost us from seeing the first trillionaire. Is that a thing where your book is getting to? Are you advocating to stop us from seeing the first trillionaire?
Well, as a socialist, according to what I see here, I must have incredibly outrageous, unpopular, extreme views like supporting Medicare for all or worker control over industry. But to me, shooting Jeff Bezos into the sun, I mean, as an economist, we have to think about what's fiscally responsible. That's very costly. We should look at shooting Jeff Bezos into more affordable deadly targets, such as the moon or the Pacific Ocean. It's all about bang for your buck and being a careful administrator of public funds.
See, this is why I like economists, Rob. Bang for your buck. See, I think that you understand it. And here's the thing. I think we're going to find this interview that we actually agree more than we disagree. Okay? Because there's actually another book coming out that you may have issue with. And so the description for this new book that I believe is yet to be written, and it is, we are currently living in the era of big tech. Mega corporations like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple wield enormous market power and political influence, which they deploy to curb competition and turn massive profits. But their power is more than just money. They exert startling control over Americans' daily lives by collecting more personal and private information from their users than any other company or government in the world. They regulate and influence the news and information consumers rely upon to make decisions about their families, politics, and health. They organize, manipulate, and direct the conversations that Americans are having. Now, this is coming from a book by Republican Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. Josh Hawley, sorry. The Tyranny of Big Tech is going to be the name of his book. Now, do you think he's using the same kind of language that you are?
Yeah, he is. And,
do you take issue with that?
I take issue with him publishing a book so similar to mine. That's the real crime is against property owners such as myself.
Yeah, did he read your book, do you think?
Let's hope so, or his isn't going to be very good.
Well,
let's hope he has.
If you were one of these big tech firms, what would you do with this guy? I think you would reach out to Senator Josh Hawley and be like, hey, I'll give you $1,000. You give me your book, and then I'll just release it under my name. And then you got a sequel already written for you.
That's a great idea. That's very popular with people. Yes, having someone else ghostwrite your book and then taking credit for it. Milo Yiannopoulos and Bill O'Reilly do that a lot. So I should copy their playbook. That would be ironic.
He didn't write Killing Lincoln? Bill O'Reilly didn't write that himself?
It seems, of course, like you could do a nightly national cable show and write a book every 4 months. I mean, I could do that in my sleep, but I heard that he hired someone to write it, so I guess it's surprisingly not true.
What about killing JFK or killing Genghis Khan or killing Pol Pot? He didn't write any of those
killing
books.
MLK. I mean, I think Bill O'Reilly has a lot of fantasies about that, probably.
That's a book too interesting for him to write. Sadly, that's too actually readable for it to be something he would take on.
Probably, yeah.
But
So
with
you take issue though with Josh Hawley. I mean, you know,
Yes.
there are some prominent GOP allies. Maybe.
We're starting to agree. I mean, here's the thing, Rob. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but you're trying to go and try and hold these giant corporations accountable, right? Who has held them more accountable in the public eye, a politician, more than Donald Trump? You're in a sigh.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, to me, if you look at Hawley's complaints, they're kind of similar to what the rest of the Republican caucus is saying, which isn't that these companies are even too big or too wealthy or too powerful. Even it's that they aren't right wing enough. They claim that they're censorious of conservative views and don't let them on, And of course, above all, the great President Trump, yes, who, on Twitter or Facebook occasionally has had his more outrageously phony remarks flagged or sometimes even removed from the platform in the extreme cases. So they look at that and say, oh, we're censored on Facebook. But if you take a look at it, like the most popular stories in terms of their reach on Facebook's platform, very reliably are right-wing ones. It's Ben Shapiro, it's PragerU, it's all your usual right-wing suspects, So it's difficult to sustain that claim that Hawley and these others are making, that the platforms are leaning so heavily against them, even when they very occasionally are sort of forced by the president's remarks and their truthfulness. When their hands are forced by that, it's hard to reach from that and agree with Hawley's premise that the right is being repressed on platforms where they're dominating the discourse.
But that we can't be held responsible for having more interesting and let's say maybe even salacious stories that people want to click on. Is that a crime?
It's not a crime. It's a success story. When PragerU posts a video about, feminism just is the reason why you can't get laid and other truthful truths like that. They're able to boost it hugely, of course. No one typically wants to believe something that's stupid. But when you have Coke and Adelson Dark Money paying for promoted posts and paid posts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, you can have a surprisingly wide reach, which is great because PragerU has so many great ideas that young people should be thinking hard about.
But so I guess it's more of like a chicken or the egg sort of thing, especially in like a case like PragerU, or especially YouTube has gotten a lot of flack for like their algorithm and leading people to like more right wing. What?
QAnon. Al Gore drinks baby blood. He carries a little fridge around with him everywhere he goes. Videos about that. Yeah.
If I want to watch a 2-hour video to try and hear both sides of the story and get the evidence from some guy in his bedroom,
well, aren't you burying the lead because YouTube banned thousands of QAnon accounts? So isn't this an example, Rob, of big tech monopolies doing good?
It is a favorable thing up to a point when you're removing posts from people who are actively calling for public officials like Ocasio-Cortez to be assassinated or for the governor of Michigan to be abducted. Little things like that, like threats of violence, or incitement, as they say in legal language. Like that's been where the line for permissible speech has been drawn for many years. You can tear down a figure all you want, but when you actually say, someone should put a bullet in their head, like, oh, oops, you screwed up, you went too far, you called for actual violence. And that's been something that's been cited by, Facebook and YouTube and others when they ban accounts, like several of these QAnon accounts, the Alex Jones and InfoWars accounts and so on. But of course, the downside of that, which many of us on the left, from Current Affairs to The Intercept to others, have been fretting about for years, is that this is going to be immediately turned around and used against the left. And indeed, already, we have a number of so far anecdotal pieces of evidence where people trying to post videos about Palestine or host Zoom conferences related to Palestinian rights, or where people are posting about socialism and the successful Bolivian socialist victory against the American coup of last year, which happened this week. And those articles can't be posted, or just the platforms indicate like, we're not allowing people to share or comment on this right now. So the upside of it is, you get to remove people who are actively calling for shooting social democrats in governments. The downside is that the platforms are delighted to swivel around and then use that to repress the left, which of course is making arguments against the commercial economy that these companies rely on for their top line revenue.
So if these companies start rocking the boat and they start offending us, the consumers, we then have the opportunity to then build alternate platforms like Gab and Parler, things that we can use to celebrate free speech and use good old capitalistic competition to take them down. Right? Is that not an option?
Unfortunately, it is, in fact, much like failure, it is not an option because of the economics of networks. See, so that first chapter in the book, of course, talks a little bit about what we call network effects or network externality. Some products, you buy them and you just consume them and they're just separate events. So if I buy a pair of Nike shoes and then you buy a pair, your buying them doesn't make my pair any more valuable. They're just unrelated commercial purchases. On the other hand, if I buy if I give someone a smartphone who hasn't had one before, it makes everyone else's phone slightly more useful to them because now there's another party that you can connect with on the telecommunications phone network, right? So we call this network effects. And the thing about network effects is that they really encourage having a single dominant standard, a technical standard that allows people to communicate across the network. And so we often see that these networks are very prone to monopoly. For example, AT&T, which had a full monopoly of telephony all the way almost entirely through the 20th century there until it was broken up by the government in 82, I believe. And in Facebook and YouTube especially, people want a single hub because you want to put your video where there's the biggest audience. Audiences want to go where there's the biggest selection of video. So just the economics of network-mediated industries, like most of these tech markets, from software to video to smartphone operating systems, they have built-in economic forces that make people want to have a single hub or maybe one or two platforms like iPhone and Android for the smartphone operating systems. That's where you tend to end up. So sadly, the usually incredibly reliably great capitalist system does have some economics that work against consumer freedom. Sad to say.
What? I don't believe that. But
we've seen some of these companies unseat other companies like Facebook to MySpace. Apple was the underdog for such a long time.
Well, I was just going to say, Facebook has given us so much. Farmville, Mafia Wars. I'll never forget gunning down my grandma in Mafia Wars. And, you
couldn't do that on MySpace?
Yeah.
But so what stops someone today from being able to create a new search engine in their garage to unseat Google the way they unseat Yahoo?
Well, fortunately, there's what we call in economics barriers to entry in a lot of markets, and this is common. I mean, something that we see all across the economy, not just in tech, is something like economies of scale, where if you have an industry that has big upfront costs, like building a data center or laying down power lines or building a manufacturing plant, it's a very, very large upfront investment, which can run up to billions of dollars if, for example, you're building a smartphone chip factory or something like that. But then as you produce more and more units year after year, it's like you take that upfront cost and spread it over more and more units. So your per unit cost decreases as you get bigger, as you get the scale. And that makes it very difficult for a new firm to come in and compete with you. That's why Tesla struggles so much, apart from its high price points, to compete with GM and Toyota, because those firms are huge and established. It can make a sedan or an SUV at a much lower unit cost. Big tech and search engines has that issue. Those quick search results and auto search suggestions. Those things require gigantic data centers, which are not cheap to build. But further, that network effect means as more people use these services, it makes them more attached to the ones that they're using. And Google is a classic case. It's not just that it pays Apple and the smartphone makers like Samsung to make its search engine the default, which it does do. But the issue is every time you do a Google search, Google collects all the information about what you searched, who you are, where you are, everything else it knows about you. Which link did you click on? Did you click on one and come back because you weren't happy? Or did you click it and stay with it because you got the right one? Every Google search you and your friends have ever done, they have recorded and used to refine their search engine. so as a result, popular search engines like Google and even the wretched Bing that Microsoft keeps on life support, they're far superior to your brand new search engines, which, God bless them, don't have those years of algorithm training thanks to billions and billions of searches over a period of years. And it becomes extremely daunting for another firm to break in. That's why there's not 30 search engines competing the way there are for like local gas stations and shit.
Well, I just want to clarify. You said Google knows everything me and my friends have searched.
Yeah, right? I'm afraid so, including
not in incognito
embarrassing
mode.
Things.
Not incognito mode.
We can thank them for graciously giving us.
Yeah, like that's kind of a neutral zone, right?
Although you do need to be careful. Often incognito mode is a browser setting as opposed to a search engine setting. Of course, with Google, as with many of these firms, you have the ability to invest hours looking at your privacy settings and adjusting what data is collected. Typically, it's just about whether that data is used to show you ads. Typically, they collect it no matter what. But I'm afraid your little Firefox mask logo up in the corner will not be enough to protect you from Google knowing exactly the weird sex shit that you Google. Sad to say.
Well, I watched the Borat movie this weekend, and like him, I've Googled, spit roast cream pie before, and it was not sexual. I just want to. I'm telling my wife right now. You heard me. Anyway, but there is.
We're gonna spit roast a real pie. People must do that.
What better thing to put in a pie than cream? Anyway, you're talking about there can't be a new player in this, but there's one new-ish player that you couldn't have foreseen their rise last year before Corona, but that's Zoom. Right? They've exploded and become one of the next big monopolists. Maybe they've certainly set the stage for it. So are you worried about that? And is there anything we could do to zip Zoom in the bud? Because I'll bet you Jeffrey Toobin is wishing that we could have nipped Zoom in the bud right now.
I think we should all be thinking foremost about what Jeffrey Toobin's going through. I mean, yeah, there's an election.
It's hard.
There's an election and climate change or whatever, but what is Toobin going through? That poor guy. Yeah, who among us hasn't masturbated on a work-related Zoom phone call? I'm sure we all have all the time. Any one of us could have made the error of letting our coworkers see us actively touching ourselves. That's like a classic American coming-of-age story. We've all had that experience.
And when you're as rich as him, you have to get completely naked to jack off, or it just won't work.
Doesn't count.
One of the great luxuries of life is getting serious about jerking off. I mean, yeah, you could find love and find someone you actually like making love to. I mean, yes, that option exists, but let's not overreact.
Yeah, but flashlights are on sale.
Yes, the rise of Zoom is an impressive story, especially because we already do have incumbent firms in the streaming video space. Skype, for example, which, only weirdos use Skype, of course.
That's right.
But it does exist as an incumbent. Remember, barriers to entry don't mean it's impossible for a new firm to enter the industry. They make it harder. That's what it means. So just like the actual barriers to entering like a castle or a fortress or something, the goal is to make it harder and to beat back most would-be competitors. It doesn't mean it works in every instance. Just because the barbarians breached the gate one time, it doesn't mean you should forget about ever having gates. And of course, we should build giant gates and walls around our country to keep out weird foreign people. We should throw that in.
So how much stock did you buy in Zoom? Because you seem to be a guy, you're an economist.
Yes, as an economist, of course, most of my income arises from consulting with super right-wing libertarian entities. I do a lot of that. So I have a huge amount of cash as a community college professor. I've just got gigantic amounts of money. So I invest, of course, in all of these giant companies. I criticize them and I buy into them. That's the economist way.
Well, I also want to thank Skype for helping make this podcast possible.
That's
Skype?
right. Well, I'm going to throw something at you that I'm sure you've heard a lot because, plenty of people will tell you, I think, if they hear this general thesis that's in the book, and they might say, well, we already gave up our privacy for free jib-jab videos a long time ago, and there's nothing we can do about it, right? And the pandemic has actually made these big tech firms even stronger, right? Because billionaires on the whole got $637 billion richer over the last 7 months. So
increased to their wealth over that time. Yes, that is very, very true. These online platforms, as already dominant as they were, I mean, my book came out in February, right before the advent of the public health crisis. And back then, they were clearly the new dominant rising core of capitalism and are kind of now co-dominant along with Wall Street as sort of the center of the system. That's something else I discussed in the book. You know, capitalism always has a churn and new industries rising and falling, but tech was on the ascendance before this pandemic forced everyone, yes, on a large basis, except for poor people who are unluckily essential workers and have to jeopardize their lives. The rest of us are indoors watching more YouTube, spending more time on Facebook, putting more files in the cloud than ever before, and ordering online. So all of that stuff is grease to the wheels of Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, the big five that I have a chapter each on in the book. But as you said earlier, too, the issue of privacy, and we decided to trade away our privacy, that and the people, we sort of made that choice. That, of course, is very, 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 very true. We all recall when Farmville was popular on Facebook. Remember, it was Farmville. You start the little Farmville game on your Facebook app or on your desktop, and it would say, "Welcome to Farmville. It's a fun game where you try to grow crops and you work with your friends to produce more delicious farm fresh fruits and vegetables, and we'll collect all the information about you and your Facebook friends and any data we can, and we'll exfiltrate it from the site in order to elect Donald Trump, and you can also have livestock in the game." That was how the game started out, right? It was always very clear that these companies were going to take an enormous amount of data from us and aggregate it with all the data they could steal from the other loosely regulated platforms of the company's fast growth period in the early 2000s. I think we all went into it with our eyes very, very open. I mean, none of us really did, but I think we did in a way.
I gotta say, I think it's actually good because I actually avoided Farmville because I thought it was communist. But now to know that my data is being stolen and sold to corporations, now it makes it very capitalist.
Well, what's the cliche, Rob? They call it a Faustian bargain. We made a deal with the devil. Netscape did, I guess, in 1991, where we decided that it was okay to get things for free and then just have the companies profit off of our personal data, right? So that's going to accelerate now.
Yeah, it's a great deal, Yeah, you get to play annoying app games that you will be sick of and never think of again after a couple of weeks. And companies get to know everything about us for our lifetimes. It's a pretty fair, again, capitalism delivers the goods. People like fair trades like that.
Yeah, but what's the answer? What do you think we should do about it in terms of how we would regulate these companies? And it seems like it might be a little difficult to regulate them because they are, as we've been saying, very powerful.
Indeed. Well, luckily we have a number of proposals that we can at least use as a starting point for thinking about this stuff. Several of them were floated during the especially Democratic presidential primary from Elizabeth Warren and that rotten, no good Bernie Sanders.
Oh, not even a Democrat.
This is the one thing we agree on in this show.
Not even a Democrat. Oh. Who would even listen to them once they heard that indictment?
Do you remember when he preempted Stacey Abrams' response to the State of the Union? By having the video go on 20 minutes before her? Oh,
just
man.
Rude.
Pepperidge Farm remembers.
He would. But looking back at his, of course, extremist and discredited ideas, along with Warren, who spent a little bit more policy time discussing this subject, you have a number of options. Right? You have straight-up regulation where you make national legislation requiring firms to, for example, not compete against users of their platforms, so not letting Amazon sell products that compete with the third-party users that make up a majority of sales on Amazon's platform, or not letting Apple have apps that compete with the apps on its own app store and in which it actually favors and sometimes disables ratings because the apps suck so bad. That would be one option that exists, kind of a more, conservative, as it were, putting just some guardrails on the market and letting otherwise the magic of supply and demand work within certain legal limits that we set. Other options would be, for example, breaking up the firms, which is something that people talk about doing. The United States hasn't broken up a company since AT&T in the early 80s, which was almost 40 years ago, God help us. Yeah. Microsoft got pretty close to getting the axe in 98, had the big antitrust suit brought against it and actually led to a federal court adjudicating it to be a monopolist legally in the court and ordering a breakup. But luckily, its appeal lasted through the incredibly fair 2000 election, and Bush's Justice Department dropped the demand to break up the firm. I rather doubt that even Google will get broken up. Antitrust law in the United States is based on monopolization. It's not illegal to have a monopoly in America. It's illegal to use your monopoly to take over other industries, which is what Google may get in trouble with for its paid sponsorship, where it pays for its search engine to be the default on all these phones, both Android and iPhones. That's the case. Microsoft, it was using its Windows operating system monopoly to try to take over the web browsing. Well, I mean, they did take over the internet browser market. They crushed Netscape. That definitely worked.
Yeah.
But again, they were able to skate from that and get little limits to their behavior, which they then started ignoring once people stopped paying attention, because it was left up to them to self-monitor, which is a great, great choice. Realistic, if we want to really deal with the power of these companies, of course, you could go really crazy and talk about socializing the platforms, which is what I discuss in Chapter 10 at the end of the Bit Tyrants book, available now. And in that book, we mentioned that socialism refers to worker control. It's not just government-run something. It's worker control. When you go to work, you and your coworkers have access to information that management keeps for itself. And you guys work together and settle on what you're going to do and work with other companies that you must operate with and work out a plan for economic production along lines of free association. And that would mean us users working with the platform operators to decide what the terms of service are going to be for YouTube and Facebook. And, that's another option for these crazy young people who don't love capitalism and for some reason are open to socialism. Who knows why? I've never heard of climate change or student debt. I have no idea why.
Well, I also want to say something else to our young people. You brought up the 2000 election, and I just want to say that back then with Microsoft, when they were going to be broken up from being a monopoly, that was a very divided time, the year 2000. So George Bush is trying to move on from the 90s and just leave all that stuff just to die back in the 90s. Let's move on to the new 21st century. And also, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, you're an economist, but I think, and again, this is where I think we agree more than we disagree, we already have worker control because these companies exist. We exist with them. We make Facebook profiles so Facebook can exist. We search Google so Google can exist. We put our products to sell for a company on Amazon, and Amazon is selling it for us. We, the consumers, are a part of these big tech companies.
Indeed. And in a way, we are the most indispensable part because, yes, without our cat videos and our facial book posts and websites that we make for Google to index, I mean, they have no content. They, apart from Apple, just recently, these firms don't produce their own content. They organize or bring together or otherwise network content creators and consumers, whether it's video or software or apps or whatever it is. So we definitely are a part of it. And therefore, I mean, we're part of it. We must like it. It's capitalism. It's free association,
Thank you. We agree. I think we can end the interview right there.
Yeah, it's fine. I wrote a book called Capitalism versus Freedom, but I think I must have been confused when I wrote it. I forgot that markets are free. So I withdraw that book. Also, I should refer to that.
I forgot everything we said when we interviewed you for that book. I forgot our whole conversation. So that's
a stroke of luck right there. Phew.
But so continue telling me why am I wrong, Rob?
Yes, you could argue that because of the network effect and platform economics that shape the dominance of these incredibly huge, powerful firms and the fact that they're used by literally billions of users, you could argue that it makes people who get onto these platforms and create accounts and post to them and so on. People are maybe not taking the full amount of time they could to look into exactly how much of their information is being stripped by the firms for advertising, targeting. You could argue that these folks are sort of making the bargain that's there for them to make and posting content because they want to be visible and they want their voice to be heard. And if you want that today, it sort of means you have to be on Facebook and YouTube or Twitter or the other high-profile, basically public squares of today. The Supreme Court has ordered that people have a constitutional right to access Facebook, because that is where the public square occurs and where politicians argue about subjects and where there's debate around political issues and so on. Like, that is a real ruling. That's not a joke. So you could make the case that because these platforms are so necessary and they have such long exhausting terms of service. Again, open up any one of your favorite apps and just try to read the entirety of the terms of service. Just try it. I bet you won't, because they're insanely lengthy corporate, commercial, legal documents are about the least readable genre of material that exists in the world, you could say. So those would be arguments that people have a real asymmetry of information, as we call it in economics, where one side of a transaction knows so much more than another. And again, no one expected that the personality profiles that they took on Facebook in 2006 were going to lead to the data, all their Facebook data and that of their friend network being used and pulled out of the network so that Cambridge Analytica could help elect Donald Trump.
I believe
I doubt that
stolen.
that's something that people were aware of.
It was stolen from them in the dark of night by Russian teen hackers, if I recall.
They broke in. Hackers, you mean people who have laptops and hoodies? I've heard of that.
Yeah.
So also, do you think, Rob, then that there could be a world where we are basically more connected? What if we're getting paid for our data?
Because we are the product, right? I mean, of Facebook and Google, that people pay to have access to their users.
Indeed. And we do get out of it, of course, free access to these platforms. YouTube, Facebook, these things are free to use. And so the argument that is made is that, yes, because we're not being paid, what's the business model? Well, the business model is these firms use all the data about us they get to target ads and commercials at us on and off the web. And therefore, the market then would be the advertisers paying for access to data. The seller would be the platform, meaning our attention span and information is indeed the product. So it just makes sense. Why would people complain? You get to be a product of big companies. Don't you want to be part of a Fortune 500 company, be in the limelight? It really is a pretty great deal if you think about it.
I would love to be a product. That is the ultimate, for a lover of capitalism like me, to be a product is the ultimate dream.
But there is, I think the big watchword for the talk about regulation of companies like Google and Amazon in recent years has been antitrust, right? Like, we're kind of bringing antitrust
Which I don't know what
back.
that word means. Antitrust to me seems like you can't, trust or believe in anything. You doubt everything, which means that you must be anti-God. You're doubting God. If you're anti-God, then you're against me. And if you're against God, now will be the time to say it. Rob, what is antitrust, and why do people use the word antitrust and not anti-monopoly, which is what it is, which is anti-fun, right? You tell someone I'm anti-monopoly, I don't like fun.
It's in the board game.
Yes. Sadly, the term comes from the 1890s when the Sherman Act was first drafted and put into law. And that's actually the pre-corporate era. Modern U.S. corporate law doesn't really come into effect around the turn of the century there. Back in those days, when you had a gigantic, all-powerful monopoly to control, for example, Rockefeller's Standard Oil and many other monopolies that were common in the Gilded Age at that time, you organized them through a trust structure where you take over another oil driller to control their well. You don't formally buy them, but they're part of your trust structure, so you control it. So antitrust at that time meant anti-monopoly and being opposed to gigantic, all-powerful business empires that are able to run a market and basically control government policies with regard to that industry too. So antitrust refers to, yes, breaking up monopolies, or as the original legal language reads, acting against companies which are acting in restraint of trade, using their monopoly power to keep consumers from doing something they might want to do, like buying a competing product or something like that. That's where the term comes from. And I agree, it is confusing. Yes, why would you be against trust and confidence in one another? I don't support antitrust. I trust my friends. So that's another problem with it.
Yeah, and nowadays it's not just monopoly, right? We have something called monopsony.
Yes, monopsony, of course. Yes,
I thought that was a typo at first, right?
Yeah, it really looks like one. It's that's what my word processing software says too. And of course, Microsoft would try to stop me, so it makes sense. Yes. Monopoly, of course, is where you have a single seller of a product. So in the 90s, Microsoft had 96%, I believe, global market share on PC operating systems through its god-awful Windows operating system there. Once you're over the 90% market share, people start using the M word to refer to you. That's when you have a single seller. Monopsony is where you have a single buyer. So if you're, for example, making military equipment, if you're Lockheed Martin or Boeing and you make cruise missiles and weapons of mass destruction and bombers and Bradley fighting vehicles and so on, you're not free to just sell those to any government in the world, sadly. You're not free to just sell your missiles to North Korea and stuff. You have to sell to the Pentagon or to governments that they approve through their export control panels. So that would be an example of a monopsony where you have a single buyer. And it's just another very uneven power relationship, which is kind of common in capitalism because institutions get so big, you can get to where there's a single producer or buyer of a commodity. That's quite not unheard of.
Yeah, but let's get into the solutions a little bit.
Wait, so I want to touch on one thing real quick, and that is part of the reason I think that we got here economically to a state where we have so many monopolies and they're growing at such a large scale, comes from Ronald Reagan and trickle-down economics and adopting the laissez-faire capitalism ideas from guys like Milton Friedman, who I know we talked about in the previous interview. But what do you think a guy like that, beautiful, bald, big glasses as he was, would think about bald, beautiful billionaire Jeff Bezos? What would his that sort of take be?
He's a BBB.
If people do fondly refer to Milton Friedman with his short stature and yes, baldness and giant glasses, and people.
There's nothing wrong with short men. We are people too.
Hashtag all men. Yes, and people often refer to him as being Yoda-like, which is pretty offensive when you consider the institutions he supports. But yes, he would look at a figure
Call me
like
Baby
Jeff
Yoda
Bezos.
then. Sorry.
Yes, he would look at Jeff Bezos and say, what a great value creator, He's rationalizing retail into his giant, all-powerful, twitchy-eyed Lex Luthor-like hands, and that's creating value for people. People are drawn to the platform. They buy goods from it, and they want to sell their products on its third-party Amazon marketplace. So obviously they're creating a lot of value. And Friedman, of course, would say this is an example of the freedom of the marketplace, as he famously wrote in his 1960s hit Capitalism and Freedom, showing us that Bezos and these other online platforms give us the freedom to choose which one of Amazon's independent sellers to buy from and which one of Facebook's social media apps to use. This is the positive freedom, the negative freedom from having the choice dictated to you. So Friedman would probably see his own reflection in Jeff Bezos's bald head. That is what I would say.
Well, but here's the thing. I think you're right. I think Friedman would see his own reflection in Bezos' bald head, but then he'd get really angry. And I think he and Ronald Reagan would both agree that when they tried to share the Hunter Biden New York Post story to Twitter and it doesn't let them, suddenly now we're not too free and these guys have gone too far, right? And so that's where, my colleagues, the Republican senators, are going to step up and they're going to hold Zuckerberg and Twitter Jack responsible. They're calling him to Congress November 17th to testify. What would you like to hear them ask these CEOs, Zuckerberg and Twitter Jack? With putting their feet to the fire, speaking in front of Congress, if you were in their shoes, what would you ask?
If I was in Ted Cruz's ill-fitting shoes, I would probably say, how dare you censor conservative thoughts on your platforms, because it's very difficult to find access to conservative views. I mean, conservatives are, as we all know, locked out of the liberal media.
That's not fair.
It's so unfair. I mean, yes. I mean, sure.
We have only 2 full 24-hour channels.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it's so limited. I mean, yes, by far the most dominant cable news channel is Fox, and the most prominent broadcast news channel is Sinclair. And yes, the highest circulation U.S. newspaper is the Wall Street Journal, which is also owned by the right-wing Australian billionaire that owns Fox News. And yes, the Republicans control the Senate and probably will continue to do so. And they had the White House, and they had the House until 2 years ago. But they're very repressed. I mean, that's not enough. You can't. Conservatives will not be free from repression until they control all media everywhere, and Facebook and Twitter have been forced to run any hysterical propaganda that the New York Post or One American News Network puts out. Only then, when the last independent liberal Keynesian voice is smushed At that point, they'll finally be free, and they'll be free to start their hysterical denunciations of one another and descend into a bloodletting Salem witch trial hysteria, which I'm sure we're all looking forward to.
Yes, definitely. And look, we all know that the Republicans don't give a damn about regulating industry or breaking up mega corporations, but thankfully, the Democratic Party, my team, Team Blue, does give a damn sometimes. We do have an election coming up, though, and considering that, do you think Joe Biden is going to do something about this big tech problem?
Yeah, it's difficult to expect Joe Biden to do anything at any time ever.
Why?
Including finish a sentence. Well, two reasons fundamentally. Two reasons. Reason one, Joe Biden is a walking corpse. I mean, that's reason one. Reason two is his politics is the neoliberal politics of the modern era of Obama and the Clintons, Saint Obama, I'm sure, sir. But if you review the record there, this is a political party that's aspiring to become the Republican Party. And what appears to be happening is with Trump at the helm, the corporate wing of the Republicans are hedging their bets as they did in 2008 and making sure the Democrats remain a moderately liberal, socially liberal, but still a very pro-corporate, pro-Wall Street, pro-Silicon Valley political party. So we end up with two corporate parties, one of them semi-Nazi and the other one semi-social democratic, but not really. So it's difficult to expect Biden to do anything. I mean, this is a figure who said that when Trump's out of office, the Republicans will become reasonable and will come to their senses again, which is funny because Biden was Obama's vice president, and that was before Trump. And when he was vice president under Obama, the Republicans in the House refused to pass the Farm Bill and the transportation bill to fund the highways. Driving and farming are two pretty core Republican constituent activities. But because it would be seen as a partial victory for Obama to get a farm bill through, they were voting down the Farm Bill because that political party has become like an utterly insane crypto-fascist obstructionist death cult. And so when Joe Biden says the Republicans are going to be real nice and want to work with me, and we need to make sure we have a Republican Party going forward into the future, as Nancy Pelosi has said, what that says is a political party that is scared of having the political authority, as it did in 2008, to actually make any changes. And so they didn't, after all. When Obama had when the Democrats had full control in D.C., it was the Democrats in the Senate that voted down the climate change cap and trade bill. So I expect more, if somehow the Democrats do take the Senate in a week and a half in the election, which I'm skeptical will happen. If they do, I look forward to more of the Democratic senators saying, we actually govern like Republicans. So that'll be good news for the industries like big tech and big oil that are scared of government regulations just because they're destroying the world in various ways.
Well, at least Joe doesn't have any big promises to keep, unlike Obama. He promised to do the Employee Free Choice Act if the Democrats had a trifecta in 2009. And the Democrats had to basically admit, because they did get a trifecta, that, we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to make it easier to join unions. Sorry. But I will say, I think actually that you might be wrong here, Rob, because a lot of people don't know this. But when Biden says, come on, Jack, his famous phrase, he's talking about Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey. He does not like that guy. Joe shuns all technology invented after 1991. But let's say... I do have a hotline. We have a guy in the Biden campaign, friend of the show, Brett Studler. Let's say we put in a good word for you. You're asked to come on as an economic advisor for Joe Biden's White House. What would you advise him to do about this big tech problem?
Yes, well, I'd advise him to look into ways of empowering users to not have to accept the terms of service for the platforms as fates accompli, and give them a little bit more authority over the basic landscape in which these products are offered. And in particular, I'd encourage him to pass some to encourage Pelosi and Schumer, God help us, to pass new legislation widening the scope of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Because as it is with antitrust, you have to prove consumer harm. This was the big change to antitrust law, mostly in the 80s under Chicago school economists and law school faculty like Robert Bork in particular, who argued that sure, AT&T might be a monopoly, Microsoft might have 98% market share. That doesn't mean that they're bad. They're just hyper powerful and eager to protect their dominance. That's not bad. It's only bad if they start pushing up prices that consumers have to pay. These companies, half of them offer their products for free, like Google and Facebook. So I'm rather skeptical that the Department of Justice's antitrust trial is going to do anything except force Google to stop paying for search traffic. I mean, it'll remain the dominant search engine with stupid Bing trailing along just as it is now. It just won't be able to fortify that through these exclusivity agreements. They're not going to be able to break up Google unless they can show harm. And I mean, this company gives its products away for free. That's the opposite of hiking prices. It speaks to how ludicrously neutered U.S. antitrust policy is. So I would suggest to Biden that he start looking at ways to make antitrust relevant to the era of big tech, or we're going to see these companies continue to dominate the economy and siphon up any new companies that have a potentially disruptive business model to them and keep dominating the political system with their huge amounts of lobbying spending, which has really taken off lately.
So, Rob, how could a guy like you who is trying to fight them, and, let's say if you're not invited to be in the Biden camp, how can an ordinary consumer be able to fight back against these companies? I know people like Lenny were very conflicted about using Amazon during the COVID-19 pandemic.
People made me feel very guilty for using it.
I said, what's so wrong with using Amazon? And he said 19,000 COVID cases in their warehouses. And I said, fair enough.
Yeah, Rude Bernie Bro told me that online after I shared, some of my recent purchases.
But so what would your suggestion be for the average user? Because under Obama, it used to be, I don't like net neutrality. You just change your profile photo, sign a few online petitions. What's something that someone can do now in 2020 to fight back?
Yes, well, as always, the best guidance for fighting back is to get organized. When you're an individual person up against a $2 trillion platform, I'm not a betting man, but I have an idea how that's going to shake out. On the other hand, if we start looking at groups that have thousands of members, that can take coordinated action, that can work together to educate one another and raise consciousness, as they used to say on the left, like that's the kind of potential that can lead to real change in government policy and in the platform policies themselves. One thing I recommend is, especially if you work in tech or if you're related to people who are, there is a drive to organize tech industry workers. When the right talks about how leftist companies like Google are, usually what they talk about is they refer to the company's staff, like their workforce, who are the ones doing walkouts over sexist executives getting giant golden parachutes when they're forced out of the company and resisting working with the Pentagon to develop AI for drones to kill people in Arab countries and so on. It's the workforce doing that, not the executives. Every time we see their emails, it's the executives who are trying to hide from the workforce how evil their platforms are becoming. So the best thing you can do is start to organize the workforce and the users. Right now, the Communications Workers of America have a big tech organizing effort going on, Code CWA, and you can look that up or find them on social media. I recommend doing that. Their organizing staff is actually using my book, Tyrants, as part of their organizing work and to make their organizers more effective, which I'm incredibly proud of and brag to everyone that I ever encounter about it. So organizing, in my view, is the key. And of course, talking to your apolitical or even conservative friends and relatives. I had a nice article recently in Current Affairs going after libertarian children's books just in the spirit of reaching across the aisle, which I called a pretty abominable farce, an effort to indoctrinate innocent kids. And my Twitter mentions are now unmentionable because of how incredibly angry the libertarian fan base of those books has become. So we got a long way to go to heal America and bring it together for Biden's great new era.
Yeah, those Jorgensen bros are a real hassle.
Well, listeners, one way that you can start to educate yourself is by getting the book Tyrants, The Political Economy of Silicon Valley by Rob Larson. Rob, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show.
Thank you very much.
I do want to let you know that, I was going to tell you this up top, but my Amazon Echo has been on the whole time. So if there's anything you want to say to Jeff Bezos. If you want to apologize before he hears this.
Wow. I mean, I'm sure he's personally listening to.
I hope so. I give him special messages. Sometimes when I'm in the shower, I'm like, love you, sir. Thank you for everything you've done for me.
I would say to Jeff Bezos how happy I am that Big Brother turned out to be not a scary government, but a nice corporation instead. So we were all worried for nothing.
Well, hopefully we can at least hold them to the fire and at least start getting some of these tech companies to allow us to share a New York Post conspiracy theory on their websites.
That's right.
If nothing else.
And Rob,
if you can't post tabloids, how far freedom has already fallen?
Right? You wouldn't even have Bat Boy. You wouldn't even know what Bat Boy was up to.
Bat Boy,
for our
wow.
younger listeners.
Yeah, look that one up.
World News Daily. Look it up.
Well, Rob, where can our listeners find you? Website, social media, all that?
For sure, yes. Well, in order to remain accessible to people, I am on social media. And plus, as someone who writes book-length criticisms of them, I kind of feel like I want to use these companies' products so I can remain current on exactly how heinous they are. So folks can find me on The Facial Book, just Rob Larson there, you'll see me. And on Twitter, at Ironic Professor there. And of course, most importantly, you can order the books, Bit Tyrants, and my previous book, Capitalism versus Freedom, The Toll Road to Serfdom, from the publishers, Haymarket Books and Zero Books, respectively, or from your fine local bookstore, should one survive the iron grip of Jeff Bezos and his evil Lex Luthor-like grip.
Yes, we will all hope for that. Well, thank you again, Rob, for coming on Debate Me Coward, and we hope to have you back on soon for your next book.
And I believe
my pleasure, gentlemen. I look
forward
forward
to use the B
to
word, so thank you.
Yes, I look forward to cowardly debating it with you.